My first introduction with Bob Glidden, and it's really hard to put a definite time on it, but Bob had worked with Cam Dynamics and comp cams early on, and somewhere I met him during that time before I was even involved in comp cams. I was still at Racing Head Service. And Bob came to me and we were talking about cylinder heads. You know, and anybody that knows Bob very well knows he was a little persnickety about his cylinder heads. And this is when he was running his Cleveland, and we did some pretty extensive modifications, had to cut some heads apart and weld them together and do all other stuff. And from a business standpoint, it was an awful idea to try and do that. But from a personal standpoint, it really did a lot for Bob and I to understand and know each other, have confidence in each other, and kind of, we both understood that we were shooting for something that we didn't know what was there, but if you don't shoot, you're not ever going to hit. So Bob was the kind of guy that always wanted the impossible, and we were able to think about it and try and come up with an idea and go for it. He was not a frills guy, had a manual dyno where he had to have the whole family around with clipboards writing down what the torque meter did and this and that. But he was, let's give it a try guy. I remember we had to make him some rocker arms one time because something happened and all of a sudden he went faster on a particular pass or quicker, and he noticed he had a broken exhaust rocker arm. And he was smart enough to think, what is that doing? And it's doing this. And so we had to make him some rocker arms that flexed. He didn't understand what it was doing, but he wanted to thin those out and make it flex a little bit. And this is way before spintrons or spin fixtures. This is all here. And we made that, and I argued with him and said, that's a dumb idea, but we did it. And he liked the fact that I would help him do the dumb ideas. Well, once we got something to measure what was going on, we realized really what it was doing is changing the timing events of the cam, and we started doing it the other way. But, Bob was not a guy that followed the normal path. I mean, hell, he raced a Ford and nobody else did. So he took the path that he believed in and was usually able to prove that he could figure out how to do it. Bob outworked everybody. And it was funny here, and talk about Warren and Bob for just a second. Bob was pretty to the point. And Bob looked at me one day early on and he said, I don't ever want to see you or hear of you even speaking a word to Warren Johnson. He was so afraid that I might say something that Bob was doing to Warren, and they didn't like each other. I mean, honestly, did not like each other. Wouldn't speak. Vicious competitors. So Warren did his one way, Bob did his the other way. Clearly, they were both very successful. Bob worked himself and his family to pieces. And I'm not saying Warren didn't either, but it was probably only a year or two ago at the Engine Expo that I sat down with Warren and formally introduced myself. After 50 years in this industry, I said, I'm embarrassed that we've never officially been introduced. And he laughed and said, you're right. So it was just funny that people chose their partners, if you will, and you didn't dance with the other partner. That was something. But Bob would usually work hard enough. If he had an idea, he would work hard enough to figure out how to make it work. And technology was coming along at the same time, and their crazy ideas would get tried and sometimes proven, sometimes disproven, but their crazy ideas would bring some technology in. And I'll give you a good example. Bob called one day, and if you'll picture a cam lobe, Bob called one day and said, I want you to take on this exhaust lobe and just cut the back half of it off. Just put it in a bandsaw and cut it off. I said, Bob, you can't do that. The lifter's going to go and it's just going to fly out somewhere. And he said, that's what I want you to do. I said, it won't work. Yes, it will. I said, it won't work. He said, I've already done it. Well, Bob did it and ran it, but before he ran it, he went on his lathe and put a cam in there with this crazy lobe and put a lifter block in the tool post on the lathe and a lifter in it with a valve spring and all. And he spun it on the lathe. He said, it's noisy as hell, it raises hell, but it will run. And then he had done it his goofy way with a grinder and a bandsaw and put it in an engine. And what we learned later was it was just changing the opening, the closing point of the exhaust valve. And we knew why, because we knew how to build cylinder pressure and so forth, but we didn't really understand how to measure it. We didn't have spintrons, we didn't have optrons, we didn't have any of that. Bob used his ear and just listened to it on that crazy tool post thing on the lathe. And that was the first part of how we tested valve motion. Now, Warren may have been doing it a completely different way. I learned later that the guys at Chrysler were doing it with some technology on the NASCAR side, but none of this, everybody sort of worked in silos and none of it got together. And I think this competition, as you were saying, this rivalry, sort of forced a little of that technology to come together, and that floated all the boats higher. Early on, when I very first knew Bob, we were at Englishtown racing, and Bob had two dogs, Dobermans, and Bob's boys were little bitty guys. And after the race, everybody was sitting around, and Bob, I'm pretty sure his whole life, and Bill and Etta have never drank a beer. Now, Rusty's probably drank enough for all of them, but we're sitting around after the race drinking a Coke or something, and one of the rental cops came around and said something to Bob, and the dog bit the cop right in the butt. And they had to chase him around the whole racetrack to get him back. I don't know what that cop did, but they had to stay an extra 2 days because they quarantined the dog before they let him out. But that was just a little aside thing that probably nobody ever knew about. But early on, and some of the people that will see this may know Dean Harvey. He was a kid that I had from high school, and I sort of grew him. And Bob and I were having a feud, and we would scream and holler at each other like brothers. I mean, really, Bob could get kind of rough around the edges sometimes. And we were in the middle of one of those arguments about something. I don't even know what it was. It didn't matter. They were all the same. You know, they'd flare up and go down. But we were at Indy, and it had been wearing on me and wearing on me. And I said, Dean, we're going up there in the trailer. We're going to get this over with. He said, man, I don't want to go with you. Please don't take me in there. I said, come on. We went in there and we shouted and hollered and MF'd each other and all, I'm sure the trailer was rocking. Finally, Etta poked her head in and said, Bob, we got to go make a run. He left. I left. So a couple hours later, I said, Dean, I can't let it stop like that. He was on top, and I'm not going to leave this conversation until we win. And Dean was begging me not to go back in there. Back in there we went. And we ended up settling things, and we're all buddies. And you know, something that kind of made me feel good is, well, a couple of things. We were up there for a PRI years ago, and went to visit, and I forget who was with me. Somebody from Edelbrock was with us. May have been Rick Roberts or somebody at the time. And we're in the shop, and Bob comes over to me and hugs me and tells them all that we're as close to best friends as anybody could ever be. And I thought, you know, that makes me feel pretty good. And it just shocked the rest of them. They said, holy mackerel, you know, we can't believe he'd be best friends with anybody. But when Bob got sick, right before he passed away, again, Dean and I, at the PRI show, we left, said, we're going to see Bob. Knew he was real sick. Called, and Bill said, it's not a good day, don't come. I said, too bad, we're coming. So we went, sat around the kitchen table, and it's another little story. Bob loved to cook, and he loved to cook and entertain. And we had sat around that same kitchen table and eaten dinner several times. And man, could Bob cook well. He was a good cook. And he came out, and we sat at that table for probably an hour until he got so tired he couldn't hold his head up. And he told me something that I'll never forget. He said, you know, we lived in a magic time. He said the generation that we grew up in was so cool because you didn't have to have anything but the desire to go make it happen. He said, we just could do anything we wanted to do as long as we had our mind set on it. And that probably epitomizes Bob as much as anything. We used to race at a little racetrack, drag strip in Nashville. It was Union Hill drag strip. A little short, it's still there today. It's called Music City International or something. Little short 8th mile up on the top of a mountain. You'd go through the end, you'd fall for a week and not hit anything. And we'd go up there and I'd see, here he'd come. And you knew when Bob came to race, you're not going to win. He had a ramp truck with a trailer, 2 cars, and then they run 2 complete rounds of stock or super stock, whatever it was. Everybody runs, the winner sits out, everybody comes back and runs for another round. Well, Bob would drive one car, Etta would drive the other. They'd get first and second place in round 1. Come back, Bob would drive the car in round 2, and they'd win round 2 every single week. And I think about that, you know, that's where Bob set his vision and his goal and his mind on, that's what I want to do. And he figured out how to make it happen, and it was pretty cool. Pretty cool to watch that from beginning, because at the time, Bob was a line mechanic at a Ford dealership. I was a line mechanic at a Chevrolet dealership. So we kind of started about the same place, and we just sort of grew because we were convinced we could make it happen. That's what Bob was. Bob was an incredible person. He had the most unbelievable drive inside of him that made him what he was. And he surrounded himself with people that could help him. And you weren't just okay with Bob. You were if he either trusted you or he didn't. And it was pretty cool to be on the good side of that. I really loved the man. He was unbelievable for our industry, teaching us how to be better, teaching us that we didn't need a lot of the things that people thought we needed. We just had to go figure out how to do it. And it changed, it helped change, mold our whole entire industry.
When I was a young kid, I used to get on my bicycle and I would ride over to the library to see if they had the results from the U.S. Nationals. And then, you know, Pomona, any of the big things, because you'd send in these pictures and they were on this roll and you stuck it in there, a slide roll, and it had somebody voiced over and it had the sounds of the cars and had somebody talking about what happened at this last big NHRA event. And I remember as a kid riding my bike over there to find out about it. Fast forward, 16 years later, and I'm given a number to call. And I get on the phone, and I can't believe myself. I am talking to Bob Glidden. To get an idea about the passion Bob Glidden has. This is a guy who was competing at such a level that when he wrecked his car and it's on fire, knocks the front of it off, he jumps out, takes off his fire suit, and covers the intake manifold so that nobody can see what he's doing on the intake side. Bob was such a competitor that nobody wanted to try to make money in pro stock, wanted to try to compete against him because it was just too hard. Bob would, when the Hemis came around, everybody else just threw a Hemi on it. They went, hey, the Ford Hemi doesn't work so good compared to the Dodge Hemi. What's Bob do? He gets in there and plays with the valve angles and tries every couple of degrees, intake and exhaust valve angle, to try to get the valve angle just right to make the most power. And it was very opposite of what people would think, because when the valves were laid over more, you got better flow, but the combustion chamber wasn't as good, and it didn't get as good of combustion efficiency. It didn't make as much power, especially at high RPM. So Bob's over here with this Ford Hemi standing up the valves, making it work until NHRA made it illegal. Bob with his Fairmont. This is a car that actually the only car that I know of in NHRA professional categories that went undefeated. It went through about half of a season and never lost a round. Every round it won. Bob was able to tinker with anything. He didn't care. Whether it was on the car, whether it was on the motor, he would dig and dig and dig and try to get every last bit of performance. One of the earliest things I saw was Bob Glidden was actually balancing the camshafts. We had old camshafts where he'd go in there and balance it. Bob Glidden built probably what was one of the first Spintrons for use in pro stock. But Bob's Spintron wasn't a Spintron. He just took a lathe and took a lift, put a camshaft on it and used the tool compost, bored out, put a lifter bore on it, put the spring on the side of it, and started to watch how well the lifter followed the profile with a rev kit on it. And then worked on how could he carve on it. And so he would literally go over to a grinding bench and start grinding on a camshaft until the lifter wouldn't follow the profile. This is the type of thing, I don't know if any of this made him faster, but the fact that he'd do all of this made him faster. He would try anything. There wasn't anything that he wasn't going to try. Some people go, oh, it's hard to shorten the deck. Bob just did it. Oh, it's hard to rotate the valves. Bob just did it. Oh, it's hard to make a different intake. Bob just did it. Everything that needed to happen to him. And that's why, when he retired, he left NHRA as the winningest driver in pro stock. Why? Because he just worked that hard. And you see it, the other day I called up Billy and I'm like, his son Billy Glidden, Billy, when was the first time you went to the drag strip? And Billy's like, I don't know. He goes, I think it was 7 or 8 days. I'm like, what? Yeah, Mom was, Dad was out doing something and we had to go to the track. So I think I got over, I don't think I was, according to her, I think I was like 7 or 8 days before I went to my first drag race. This was the first family of drag race. His wife was out there, his kids were out there. They were absolutely 100% put in the most work they could do. I jokingly say that Bob Glidden's the reason that Jack Roush went to NASCAR. That there's just got to be an easier way to win races and make money than to race against Bob Glidden.